Good morning, and it's great to be back with many of you and to meet some of you, at least via the internet for the first time. And what we're here to discuss today, as Kathy noted, is New York State's healthcare and mental hygiene worker bonus program. Excuse me, it has been a topic of very active conversation throughout the environment in our practice areas. And I'm going to walk through some initial remarks and framing of what the program comprises, and then I will later return after Tom Uron, who's a member in our Syracuse office, one who has served clients of bonds for many decades with a deep well of knowledge that will absolutely be informative in this conversation. He will dive into some of the operational elements of this at a further level of depth. But for now, let me begin by providing that overview I just signaled. If Kathy, please advance to the next slide, I'll begin that. So this program is one that is open now. That's really the headline all of you should please take away at minimum from this conversation, with a deadline of September 2nd of 2022 for the first tranche. And if Kathy, you'd go to the next slide, let me get into the details of how this deadline arose and really what this program is all about. So it's connected to language from the state fiscal year 22-23 budget. And within that budget, essentially there was an articulation of funds to be furnished to frontline workers, about $1 billion worth, knowing that in this pandemic, we've been living through, of course, unprecedented times. And through policymaking, it was the goal of the legislature, and then ultimately through the signature of the budget package by the governor, a wish to bring frontline workers bonus funding as a means of acknowledging their service. And so the total tallies each individual is eligible for, it may not exceed $3,000. And in any one vesting period, which we'll talk about shortly, the limit is $1,500, though not everyone is eligible for $1,500, as you can see from the excerpt to the right of the slide. It's based on the number of hours that one has worked during a vesting period, with essentially gradated levels of pay depending on the intensity of the work, as measured by hours generally during a vesting period. It's also subject to a salary cap of $125,000, it being the eligibility for any employee in the program, which excludes bonuses and overtime. That's important. We'll talk about that. Certainly, I expect Tom will raise those kinds of elements. And it also is predicated on the role that the individual held during the time when the eligibility ultimately became vesting for that individual who might well be able to partake in the program. So Kathy, if you go to the next slide, I'll explain a little bit more what I mean by that. So the employers that are eligible for this program are generally those with linkages to the Medicaid program of New York State broadly. There are some aligned state programs that are also hailed in by way of the enabling language through the budget. Some education programs are hailed in as well in ways that are driven by the discretion of the Commissioner of Health. For instance, individuals who are residents or fellows in medical care delivery contexts are eligible under the program's terms. And so we know that we have many bond clients who have a foot in both education and in healthcare delivery. So we wanted to ensure your awareness around that dynamic, among others. The timing of the bonus payments is important. They must be made by an employer no later than 30 days after receiving from New York State the funding for the bonuses. And there are really, I think it's fairly described, limitations in terms of employers' ability to opt out. really, the program is designed to ensure that these funds get into the proverbial pockets of those employees. And we further, though, understand from the perspective of employers that there are many mechanics here that are germane to how that happens. And but in short, we see few ways for an employer who is otherwise eligible to essentially pass along those funds to choose not to. There are also attestation requirements on the employer and employee side that we'll get into in a little bit of further detail later in this discussion. Next slide, please. So the Department of Health has posted a wide array of resources around this material. There's both a website and an FAQ, both of which we recommend that you, to the degree you're engaging with this program, scrutinize. And of course, all the more we can help you with navigating its terms, in particular, both the website itself and as well that FAQ. So we provide you those URLs for your reference as you begin to orient around these questions. Next slide, please. So the vesting periods, I mentioned earlier that we are in one right now. They are open between, or better put, they're based on 6 months of work that is deemed eligible under this program. The current period that is under review is October 1st of 2021 through March 31st of 22. And for activities concerning employees in that period, the submittals are required to be in by September 2nd, and there is a fair amount of legwork that precedes those submittals. There are other rounds of this program that will be forthcoming with submittals due in October of 22 and onward into 24, as you see right here on the slide. Next slide, please. And so this is where Tom will dive into some of the operational challenges and opportunities connected with this program. And certainly, as you have questions, please note that we will look to answer them in the course of this conversation. So please enter them within the chat function. And as we are able, we will certainly bring them forward and wish to make this as interactive as possible. We won't be able to unmute your microphones, I should note, but we certainly will be responsive to your chats and the questions you pose there as best possible. Tom?
Thanks, Gabe. Good morning, everyone. Appreciate you joining us on short notice today. We thought after the Tuesday webinar piece earlier this week that it warranted this deeper dive into the healthcare worker bonus program. So I'm taking this from the perspective that you are a qualified employer, that you have some employees who qualify for the bonus. And now we're talking about the operational steps that you want to undertake, particularly now between now and September 2nd, right? And I would break it down really, I think, into 12 steps. From my perspective, you start with the list of employees as of March 31st, 2022, right? The entire list of employees. And I'll say this now and I'll say it again a couple of times. We anticipate that this process will be audited in the future. And so it makes sense to have a separate standalone record-keeping approach, documentation of the steps that you undertake to comply with the program. So we start with the personnel list as of March 31st, 2022. Why that date? Because that's the end of the first vesting period. And then we look at that list. Step 2 is for employees who had a higher date on or before October 1st of 2021, right? Because the requirement is that the individual be employed for the entirety of the vesting period, and the vesting period is October 1, 2021 through March 31st, 2022. That's, as Gabe said, that's the first vesting period, that's the one we're focusing on here in August of 2022. We'll have to repeat this process several times, but for now, we're focusing on that one. I think the third step in the process is to identify those employees who are in positions that have been articulated by the Department of Health as covered positions within this program. And if you've looked at the materials to this point, you know that there is a long laundry list of very specific titles. And it's our understanding that the state is requiring that the individual be identified within that particular title as outlined in the, I'm going to call them regulations. They're not technically regulations, but as outlined in the regulations. And as I said, those are, for the most part, very specific. And I would think your documentation would reflect employee Tom Eron, hire date pre-October 1, 2021, continued to be employed as of March 31, 2022, and was in this title, which is within the designation set by the state. The focus here on this program was on direct care workers, but it is important to note that the state has included a substantial list of other healthcare support workers. And principal among that are environmental services, housekeeping, dietary, building maintenance, etc. So those are positions that are included, are eligible for this bonus program. There are within, while most of the list is very specific and you need to match, have that one-to-one matching, there are several sort of catch-all listings, which you'll need to evaluate. And if you have someone who doesn't have the exact title as listed by the state, do they fit into one of the catch-all provisions? For example, there's a list of technicians and technologists, and then the category of other technicians, other technologists is included. And I would anticipate if the job title in your payroll records does not match exactly to the state's job title, but it is a technician title, that other category would qualify. Another example is, rather than trying to define all of the different positions that are involved in the patient intake process, the regulations simply say intake/screening. So if you have employees in those categories, regardless of what the title is, I think you record that as an intake/screening position and come within the requirements of the state. So the documentation would reflect not only the position as it appears on your payroll records, but also the position within the state regulations that you conclude covers that employee. So that's step 3, right? Matching the employees to the state job titles. We know that, especially over the last 2 years, it's been extensive use of staffing agencies, maybe other temporary employment services. The regs specifically state that those individuals are not included. If the individual is employed by a staffing agency or employed by a temporary agency, they are not eligible under this program. Gabe mentioned that there's a maximum salary requirement, right? So highly compensated individuals are excluded. And that's measured by gross wages in the relevant period. And while the annual cap is $125,000, the 6-month cap would be 62,500. And it is gross wages less any bonuses that were paid or overtime payments that were made. It includes any other differential or component of gross wages except overtime and bonuses. So the next step, to my way of thinking, as we're processing this through here on August 11th, is to evaluate whether the individual is still employed by the healthcare facility, and to eliminate from this process anyone who has separated from employment as of the time that we're doing this processing. Next is to provide the employee attestation forms to everybody who's left on your list. And in that process, you have an obligation to identify the name of the employer and the code number that you're using to make your application. So it's not simply a blank form that you provide to these employees. It has to include that additional information. And then if you've looked at the employee attestation, it's pretty straightforward. Employee name, social security number, and some attestations that they meet the requirements of the program. So we draft and supply those employee attestation forms to the employees that we've identified as eligible. And I'll pause at this point to mention that for those of you who have employees who are represented by unions, you can anticipate, if you haven't already received, you will receive from the unions a request for information, essentially asking for all of the information that we've talked about to this point in time, right? They're going to want to know who among their bargaining unit is eligible, and frankly may even ask who's not eligible, but at least we likely have an obligation to provide them with a list of eligibles. And then I would anticipate some unions to be supportive of this in a more proactive way and seek to be involved in the process of getting the employees to sign off on those attestations, whether that is more communication or a request to have additional access to the employees. Those are things I think you can anticipate, because a key here is that we have to have the employee attestation back in hand on or before September 2nd. And I know it's August and plenty of people are taking time away. It's the absolute wrong time of the year for the state to have rolled this out for us, but it is what it is, and that's the requirement. So we're working on getting those attestation forms out to employees and to educate them on what it means and what the timeline is for that to be returned. In the meantime, while that process is going on, I would say as my next step, we're computing what the potential bonuses are for the employees that remain on our list. And here, some significant details, right? We're looking at the 6-month period, and we're trying to determine average hours worked. And in that process, the regulations, and in fact, the statute, speak to the fact that leave time counts as hours worked for this purpose. Now, the particular reference is accruals or other leave, including vacation, sick, and FMLA, are to be counted as hours for purposes of computing the bonus. Accruals, understandable, and examples of vacation or personal time or PTO or sick time to me, relatively straightforward and understandable. When they add FMLA leave, which can be unpaid, it expands that definition. And so it seems to me that the inference is likely that we're talking about any leave, including unpaid leave, during the vesting period. And we compute the average hours, and if it's between 20 and 30, it's a $500 bonus. If it's 30 to 35, it's 15. I'm sorry, it's 1,000, and if it's 35 or more, it's 1,500. Let me just pause here and mention something about the maximums. It's been stated repeatedly that the maximum that anyone can receive, any one employee can receive, is $3,000 over the course of these various vesting periods. That's true. There's also a limit, however, that it is a bonus paid in 2 vesting periods. So we'll have to keep that in mind when we get to vesting period number 3 as an additional limit on what happens at that point. I have on my list here as the next item to follow up with employees on the attestations, right? We have roughly 3 weeks to get this done, and it's going to take further communications with the employees. And then on or before September 2nd, submit the employer attestation, the information that we have on the employees who have made an attestation back to us, that we have a hard copy. One of the requirements that is in the employer attestation is that you have in hand the statement from the employee that they're eligible. And there's likely to be a final culling at that point. Anybody who's left employment between your first run through the data and September 2nd would obviously come off the list. And as I said, all of this should be documented. All of the reasons why employee Tommy Iran was included or excluded should be maintained separately, so that when there is that audit, you've got the full data set to explain what it is that you did and why you did it. So that takes us through September 2nd. There were 4 other issues that I wanted to touch on briefly as we look ahead, right? So the first one is generally in the category of former employees. We can anticipate that employees who were on the list as of September 2nd, there will be some who will separate employment between now and the time that the employer receives the money from the state. And those employees are no longer eligible. And I think probably worth moving to the next slide, Kathy, where we talk about some of the issues on these questions of payment, so forth. So in terms of former employees, they're not eligible. Employees must be on the payroll at the time that the employer receives the money and makes the payment in order to maintain their eligibility. One of the questions that's come up since Tuesday is, well, are there other obligations for the employer here, right? What's the tax implication of these bonus payments? What do I need to be prepared for in that regard? And the statute actually provides that this bonus payment is not income for purposes of New York State income tax. So it's exempt from New York State income tax. But given the nature of the payment as money paid for work performed, it's very likely to be treated as wage income for purposes of federal income tax. And so it's subject to withholding and to FICA. The other big question that comes up is, well, if the employee has worked overtime during the vesting period, does this bonus payment have some implication for the overtime pay? So obviously we're talking about non-exempt employees who may be eligible for overtime, either over 40 in a week, or if you're on the 8 and 80 rule. And it seems that the answer to that is likely yes, right? Because ordinarily a bonus payment for associated with hours worked is included in the regular hourly rate. And if the bonus covers a period that's longer than one payroll period, you divide the total number of hours worked and apply the that to a factor of 0.05, 0.5, as an additional compensation on the hours that were in excess of the standard hours. I'm very comfortable saying we can anticipate that the U.S. Department of Labor would treat this money as part of the regular hourly rate. I haven't seen an opinion yet from the New York State Department of Labor, and I'm aware of some recent litigation, and in particular, a recent court case that challenged the U.S. Department of Labor interpretation and actually found in a somewhat similar circumstance that the bonus did not count toward the regular hourly rate. Now, that was not a New York State decision. It was not a Second Circuit decision. So I would be very careful and talk to your legal counsel about how you want to treat that bonus money vis-a-vis the issue of overtime pay in the vesting period. And again, for those of you who have a union agreement, it's likely that you have to look at the overtime issue from the perspective of the union agreement. Would this bonus be included in the computation of overtime as set forth in your collective bargaining agreement? And for those of you that participate in multi-employer benefit funds and contribute on the basis of a percentage of compensation, you want to look closely at the terms of those agreements and the terms of the trust fund to understand whether or not this bonus payment is going to create an additional obligation to contribute to those funds. And that's going to be strictly a matter of contract, and it's going to depend significantly on the language that is in your agreement. So those are the key issues that I wanted to cover. I know we're closing in on noon. Any particular questions, Gabe, that we ought to try to knock out here before we finish?
Absolutely, Tom. One that we received concerns the attestations. And the question is whether they can be collected electronically. The DOH hotline, according to one questioner, has evidently indicated that they can only be collected by paper with original signatures. Do you happen to know the answer to that? If not, we'll certainly research that.
I don't know that, but I do know that the form for the employee attestation calls for a original signature, whereas the form for the employer attestation allows for an electronic signature. So I think just by looking at the forms, it would be consistent with the comment that that was made.
Great. And then another interesting dynamic that questioner has brought forward. What about telehealth employees? Are they eligible for the bonus, assuming they hold an eligible title in other respects?
That's a very interesting question. I haven't seen anything that specifically addresses it, but I am hard pressed to come up with a basis to exclude them. So if we're talking about an individual who is providing direct patient care, but virtually as opposed to in person, I would think that that individual would be eligible, but I have not seen any particular guidance on that point.
Great. Another question, briefly, Tom, is whether an employee can opt out of one vesting period to wait for a better one, one where perhaps there were more hours worked, for instance.
I could see a scenario where that would happen, right? Because the employer can only make a claim if it has a employee attestation. And if the employee declines to attest in a particular period and waits for another, it seems to me that there's a path that you could follow there. Again, I haven't seen anything official on that, but it doesn't seem to me to be precluded by the regulations that have been issued to this point.
Another question, maybe a little bit in the weeds, but it'll certainly matter to many. Are the funds received by the employer subject to the cash receipts assessment through the Medicaid program?
I think there is an answer on that, but I don't know the answer off the top of my head. I believe I saw some reference in the statutory materials. But I want to double check that before stating opinion before the group.
Okay. And I know we're just a couple minutes over the top of the hour, but let me make sure, Tom, we ask of you all those questions that we haven't addressed already. I think that the key, as I see, is just a fair number of questions around how one calculates ultimately whether the bonus is subject to base rate and overtime rules and the timing of that calculation. These are the kinds of questions, as I read them, that are really going to be specific to the organization. And these are the kinds of questions where I would respectfully recommend that those who are participating contact those bond attorneys with whom they work most regularly in order to drill down on the details so that we can guide you on those calculations. But outside of that, Tom, I think we've answered through your commentary most of the key queries that have been raised. And I'll reiterate on behalf of the bond team, Tom and myself, but of course the many attorneys that join us as part of our firm. We're ready to help and we're ready to guide you as you prepare these submittals. Tom, are there any final remarks that you'd wish to raise?
Just to thank everyone for participating today, and we will continue to update you as we learn of developments. Thank you.
Okay, we wish you well.